Trouble Together, Chapter 2. Driving Together on Country Roads. The country roads of Kalos were a beautiful sight to behold. They wound and twisted with the flow of the land, leading them past amber fields of wheat and thriving pastures of Pokemon, interspersed with long sections of wood and untamed grasslands. The mountains of western Kalos loomed ahead of them, and there was hardly another soul on the road. The dark autumn clouds overhead had probably scared them all inside. Not Lysandre and Augustine, though. They loved the rainy weather enough to brave conditions both sane and not sane when they took walks in their sleepless city. On the road was a little bit different. There was nothing fun about getting stuck in the rain while they were driving. Especially not when Lysandre had decided to take his soft top out for the drive. They're getting closer. Augustine, whose seat was reclined far back and whose feet were stacked up on the dashboard, said as he peered up over them. They were cruising comfortably along the narrow lane, not too fast and not too slow as they took a relaxing drive towards Silage City. It was supposed to be a work outing for a league project they were working on together, and originally Augustine was going to take the train by himself because Lysandre technically was supposed to be doing other work. But how often did he have a chance to take his Ferrari out of the city? The open road had been a sweet siren song, and he just couldn't resist. Not when it could just be the two of them, alone, breathing in the fresh air as the wind whipped harshly around them. "We may have to cut our trip short," he grumbled. "Looks like it's going to be bad." The clouds weren't so dark he worried for lightning, but still definitely dark enough that he was certain there was a downpour in their future. "I'm going to turn around the next chance we get." "Well, not here." Augustine lifted his head, peering over the side of the bright red convertible and down into the farmlands. "The drop's a little steep, I'm afraid. Unless you'd really like to give those Maripa a good scare. I'll floor it straight into that barn for shits and giggles if it entertains you." "Lysandre, such a filthy mouth on you!" His boyfriend laughed and stretched out wide in his seat, then folded his hands comfortably behind his head. "I ought to wash it out with soap. Your family would be ashamed." "Really? Over something that minor? There's a lot worse where that came from." I'll believe it when I see it. Perhaps we can park somewhere a little more secluded, and you can show me how filthy it Suddenly, they hit something, maybe a pothole, maybe debris, and the whole car bounced and shook violently, leaving the two swearing in unison as Lysandre fought to keep control of the wheel, while Augustine scrambled upright with a painful grimace. "What was that?" he cried as Lysandre righted them back into the middle of the lane. "Whatever it wasn't good," he grumbled in return. "Are you alright?" Yes, I'm fine. A bit shaken, a bit bruised. You?" The dashboard was lit up like a beacon, and that was of more concern to Lysandre at the moment than his own slight bruising. He couldn't help but let out a growl, his eyes darting between the orange warning lights in the road ahead. It would be better to stop and check everything over. And what was that thumping noise? Augustine must have heard it too, because he suddenly leaned even further out over the car door. "I think we've got a flat," he announced. "Damn it!" Lysandre swore again, smacking his palm to the wheel in frustration. "Of course. That's just our luck, isn't it? It's going to pour any minute. This is a disaster." No, it's fine. I'll let the breeder know we won't make it, so just pull over when you can. We'll deal with it." He could spy a dirt driveway further down the country road. It would have to do, because there was still hardly any shoulder for them to pause on. Thumping along with their bad tire, he slowed the convertible to a neat stop and pulled the handbrake, then swiftly set the soft top to rise back into place. He tapped at the screen in the dashboard console with a petulant frown. "What are you doing?" Augustine asked him, more amused than anything as he watched. "I'm calling my roadside assistance," Lysandre huffed, "though I'm sure it will be hours until they reach us." Before he could finish scrolling through his contact list, Augustine slapped his hand aside and turned the console off, then unlatched his seatbelt and let himself up. Lysandre frowned after him. "What was that for?" "Well, I doubt they'll be able to do the rest of that here," Augustine answered, motioning vaguely to all the warning lights. He shut the passenger door and squatted down in the dirt. Rolling his eyes, Lysandre released his own seatbelt and followed him out, coming around to the side of the car. He was staring hard at the tires, his eyes slipping between them, until finally he pointed to the front wheel. "This one," he announced. He looked expectantly up at him. Lysandre stared blankly back. "Well, I'm glad we figured that out," he deadpanned. "Come back inside before it starts raining. We're going to be out here for a while." If there was one particular thing about Augustine that Lysandre could pinpoint as to what made people instantly comfortable with him, it was that he was always gentle and kind to his acquaintances, and always filled with joyful mirth at the world around him. That was how he trapped you. Because if there was one particular thing about Augustine that Lysandre could pinpoint as to the reality of the man buried underneath the scruff and the lily-pup eyes, it was that he was a complete asshole whose brutal and condescending sarcasm might as well have been his first language. He was basically a human Mawile. "Of course," he snarked. "Whatever made me think the genius behind Lysandre Labs knew how to change his own tire?" He motioned back towards the leather seats. "Please, my lord, sit on your throne. This humble and weedy scholar shall take care of everything in your stead." It was supposed to just be teasing. Probably. But Lysandre sulked, nonetheless. He wasn't some pampered prince. He was an entrepreneur. And yes, he could normally just pay someone to take care of these sorts of things for him. Why work harder when he could afford to make someone else do it? But he was also stubborn, and determined to prove, oh yes, he could change his own goddamn tire. He folded his arms across his chest and leaned petulantly over Augustine. "Not like you've ever changed a tire," he huffed. "You don't even have your own car." "Well, I have a license, you know. I used to drive Rowan all over, and let me tell you, roads in Sinnoh are ruthless. I've changed my fair share." He popped back up to his feet and stalked his way around to the boot, where he opened it up and began to rummage around inside. Lysandre followed him like a lost Marie. He was aware, of course, of the basics. They would need the cross iron and the jack and whatnot. They would hoist the car up on the jack, swap the tire out, good as new. Except... "It's starting to rain," he observed as he felt the first stirrings of a drizzle. He held one palm out as he frowned up at the clouds, the wet droplets splattering against his skin. "Then let's be quick. Here, lift the car while I fish out your spare." Lysandre thought he was doing a pretty bang-up job, to be honest. As Augustine hefted the spare into the driveway, he figured out with relative ease how to hook the lever into the jack, then slid it under the chassis. He was getting ready to start cranking when Augustine rolled the tire over, then paused to look over his shoulder. "Wrong," he chirped. Lysandre's lips pursed as his boyfriend leaned even further over him to point around the car. "You'll damage it like that. There should be markings underneath that show where it's safe to lift from. Try again." "You're asking for trouble today." "My love, trouble is my middle name. Now, try again." The scattering of droplets picked up to a much more steady shower as Lysandre worked, fully aware of Augustine's watchful eye on his every move. Soon the convertible was lifted from the ground, and together they undid the bolts and swapped the tires out. "Your hands are so soft." "I take it back. It makes perfect sense that you've never had to change a tire," Augustine teased as they fit the spare onto the wheel. This time, Lysandre's scathing look caught those impish gray eyes, and he growled out, "Next time you need me to fix your computer, I'm going to remember this." Lysandre ended up holding the tire as Augustine wielded the cross iron with practiced precision to bolt it down. The rain came down harder and harder, and by the time it was sufficiently tightened and they let Lysandre's car down, it had quickly progressed to the threatened downpour he'd expected. "Get in the car," he called over the wind and icy sheets to Augustine. "I'll put everything away." He didn't protest as Lysandre began to gather the tools and quickly slipped into the passenger seat and yanked the door shut. The soft top was getting all wet, Lysandre thought bitterly to himself. He would have to baby it while it dried out later. If he had to deal with mildew after all of this Taro shite. He only realized how thoroughly wet he was when he finally slid back into the driver's seat, futilely attempting to dry the inside of his door with his sleeve before he tiredly noticed that he just seemed to be making it worse. Augustine shivered next to him with a smile, just as wet as he was, his curly hair frizzing and plastering to his skin. "You poor thing," he laughed, reaching across to run one hand through Lysandre's hair. You are absolutely soaked! Both of their clothes were waterlogged and dripping, and Lysander was certain it had seeped straight through his socks. No matter how he fidgeted, his shirt and slacks stuck to him uncomfortably, and he could feel residual streams of water dripping down his face and scalp. Mud had splashed up his calves and stained his knees from when he had knelt to get a better grip on the spare tire. Both of their hands were covered in dirt and grease, and his car was a mess. "This is a nightmare," he sighed, slinking down in his seat to have a good sulk. "Well," Augustine reminded him, "it's not 100% a nightmare. You've got all your tires now." He drew Lysander's face around by the cheek and leaned in to press a soft kiss to his lips, leaning their foreheads together. "So, let's try to get home before anything else can go wrong, yes? We'll reschedule our meeting for another day." If there was one particular thing about Augustine that Lysander could pinpoint as to what made him fall excruciatingly head over heels for him, it was that past his polite outer shell and his infuriatingly sarcastic and chewy middle, he possessed some strange power that made even the poorest moments of Lysander's days bearable and soothed his irritations effortlessly. It was more than just soft touches and reassuring words. It was something in his being. His mere presence took a weight off Lysander's shoulders that he'd hardly realized could be soothed before the day they met. So, even though he was soaking wet, dirty, and was probably looking at a very hefty bill to have his convertible serviced, Lysander would change absolutely nothing about his day. "All right," he agreed, stealing one more kiss. "Let's go." "You know what else?" Augustine prompted him as he started the engine and pulled back out onto the crunchy road. "I think we've got a good contender for your Halloween costume this year." "Oh?" "I think you'd look very nice dressed up as a mechanic. I can be the car." "So what, then you'll need me to fix you?" "Well, naturally. I think you'll need to check my tailpipe." Lysander couldn't help but snort out a laugh as his boyfriend grinned his usual toothy and devious smile. Augustine was here with him, and at the end of the day, that was all that really mattered.